the game is played up here. So as a nutritionist, what I have to look at is what are the things that are going to hinder someone's performance, and what do I know about nutritionally that can counteract that? I always kind of say you need to be aware of what time you're starting. So let's say if you're a club cricketer and on a Saturday you're starting at 10 or 11 o'clock, I'm starting at 10, I know that 2 to 3 hours before I need to have my breakfast, nothing in between, because it's not going to be digested in time. So that means I know that I'm eating between 7 and 8 o'clock. And I'm getting some form of carbohydrate in with my main meal, size of the fish once it's been cooked. Sorry, hydrating yourself isn't as simple as just drinking water. You need to be aware of what fuels your body uses at what intensity. So working at high intensity, body uses carbohydrates. So the focus of my food needs to be on carbohydrate during that. However, if I'm working at a low intensity, the body doesn't really use carbohydrate, we like to use fat. As soon as you finish any form of session, whether that's a training session or if it's the end of a session of a day's play, you flick the switch in the body to say start the muscle building process, and then you need to provide the body with the bricks that it requires, i.e. protein. Caffeine makes you feel like something is easier than it actually is, but in general with supplements, they supplement, they don't substitute. And then another one which is really interesting, which we use at Warwickshire, is beetroot juice. So beetroot juice essentially contains a compound in it called nitrate, which can then get converted into something called nitric oxide, which essentially increases the delivery of oxygen throughout the body.
Cricket Life Stories with me, Neel Khagram. Today we're joined by sports nutritionist Callum Walker. Callum, first of all, how's things going?
I'm very good, thank you, sir. Thank you very much for having me. Very much looking forward to talking over the next 20 or so minutes. So thank you for having me, sir.
So Callum, you're going to give us some nutritional tips and advice to improve the performances for cricketers of all levels. Before we dive into the chat, do you want us to talk through your current work in cricket and your career to date in the field?
Yeah. So just a little bit about me. So I studied a master's degree in performance nutrition at university, and then set up my own shop as a freelance nutritionist. Specifically, to begin with, I was just working with individuals, helping them to lose weight and improve their own health. But again, my specialty is in sports performance. So I started just working with young athletes on a one-to-one basis. And then I started as the academy nutritionist at Warwickshire Cricket Club in Edgbaston back in November 2017, so about 4 years ago. And then I've been working as the nutritionist for Warwickshire for the last 4 years. So I work predominantly with them. And then I also consult with Middlesex County Cricket Club, and then run my own shop on a private basis, working with individuals on a one-to-one basis. So that ranges from professional cricketers, professional golfers, Premier League footballers, really enhancing their own sports performance through the food that they eat. And then I'm currently studying a PhD specializing in performance nutrition, specifically for cricketers and golfers. So looking at improving their own physical performance, but then also mentally, how the food that you eat can enhance the brain's ability to function and fuel flow to that, which especially in cricket, is huge because the game's played up here. So if this isn't being fueled correctly, then performance kind of drops. So yes, I've been doing that for nearly 5 years now, and I'm a massive cricket fan anyway. So I play the game, I understand the game, not particularly well at the moment, but it is what it is.
Yes, if anyone wants to dive a bit deeper with you, get some personal insights, personal training, is the website the best way to contact you? Do you want to give that?
Yeah.
We'll put the link in the description below of this video. But yeah, do you want to give a little plug?
Yeah, so my website, again, that'll be below. It's www.cw-nutrition.com. I'm also very active on Instagram. So I put up frequent videos explaining various things that you can do to improve your own performance, recipes, and loads of ideas on there. So that's the best place to kind of get in touch with me. I put loads of stuff up, which should hopefully improve the performance of people who are watching.
Yeah, as I said, we'll put all the links in the description below of this video. For now, Callum, let's get into this chat. And a high-level question to start with. Can you run through the importance of nutrition in general and the detrimental effects it can have on a cricket player's performance if not taken seriously?
Well, I think that the problem with cricket is that culturally, people kind of look at it as almost you're standing in a field all day and then you just have tea and biscuits at lunch and then a few beers afterwards. So there's been a real, over the last sort of like 10, 15 years, that there's been a real shift away from just kind of your standard cricketer up to actually now looking at professional cricketers as athletes, because they are. And I think that anyone who plays the sport understands the physical demands that, especially fast bowlers, the physical demands that cricket actually has on the body. And I think that's really understated. And especially from a nutritional point of view, people don't realize, but some of the guys who I work with can burn in excess of 5 up to 6,000 calories a day. Now, if you're not fueling yourself adequately, what happens is when you create a energy deficit that big, then your body's essentially not being fueled adequately, which means that important processes such as specifically recovery can't take place because the body hasn't got the energy to be able to do that. So you find that if you're not fueling, first of all, if I look at just your standard cricketer, one of the first things I see is that they're not eating enough, let alone the right stuff. And what happens is that the body then can't repair bone, it can't repair muscle, and you find your ability to recover significantly impaired. But then more importantly, the obvious one is that if you're not eating correctly, your body's not functioning in general, so your immune system's flattened, which then means you're more likely to catch illnesses. But then that ties into recovery, because the immune system is essentially what actually recovers the body, not just health-wise, fighting off viruses and bacteria, but physically it improves your bone health and your muscle mass. But for me, the biggest thing is concentration. The game is played up here. So as a nutritionist, what I have to look at is what are the things that are going to hinder someone's performance, and what do I know about nutritionally that can counteract that? And the biggest thing is concentration. So you're looking at your hydration, you're looking at providing a steady flow of fuel, so you're not getting these big ups and downs and you're reaching for a bar of chocolate halfway through at drinks just to kind of spike yourself back up. So for me, it kind of starts off with just general health, then improving your own recovery and fighting off risk of injury. But then the biggest thing is just keeping this in play the whole time.
People that aren't experts in the field, layman's in the subject, might think of sports nutrition, athletes, etc., and what they're eating during a match and the importance of that. But how important is the lead up to the game and the kind of foods and importance and emphasis one should have in your body intake a few days leading up for a cricket match?
Well, it's massive, really. And I think that not just kind of, cricket's a weird sport, because especially as you go kind of further up, it's not just played in like a 90-minute, game. It's, can be spread up over 4, maybe even 5 days. So, it's about making sure that you're prepping your body to be able to deal with the demands of 4 or 5 days of very strenuous exercise, especially if you end up playing a big part in that. So that the main thing is that ensuring that your body's adequately fueled to be able to do that. And that comes in 2 parts. That first of all, when you're working at those sort of high intensities, as a fast bowler or even as a batsman or batswoman who's potentially going on to create a big innings, you're going to be using a lot of fuel, and specifically you're going to be using carbohydrates. And it's about ensuring that your body has a tank essentially inside of it where the body stores carbohydrates. So if you eat a bowl of pasta, you don't eat the pasta, then the body uses the pasta. You eat the pasta, the body takes the carbohydrates from the pasta, puts it into storage. Then during exercise, the body pulls from that store and utilizes it. Now, that store is very small, in that you've only really got about 2,000 calories worth of energy, 2 hours really worth of fuel to do that. So you've got to make sure that you're starting with a full tank, because otherwise you're going to find yourself almost like hitting the wall. So when you have someone, if anyone's kind of watching this who's felt lightheaded or felt incredibly weak, it's because their fuel tank's running low. So ensuring that that is topped up correctly with specifically the right types of carbohydrate needs to be someone's predominant thought before going out to play. So typically, again, with sports nutrition, there's this sort of dogma that, or even nutrition in general, that people look at it as, oh, you're just eating kind of like seeds and cardboard and all this sort of weird stuff. And actually it's quite normal food, but just put together in specific ways. So, I'll refer to this over the next kind of 20 minutes anyway, but how I kind of set up a meal, especially kind of with a cricketer, is just into really simple sort of way. So I provide the boys or girls who I work with a food list, and just say, right, I just need you to pull from this sort of food list and put the meals together. So specifically a main meal, this is mainly for before and afterwards. So ensuring you can fuel and refuel. It needs to basically have something from the protein section of the food list, something from the veg section of the food list, from the fat section and the carb section. Now beforehand, the most important part is this carb thing, because the carb aspect needs to be that's going to be what's filling up your carb tank so you can carry out the demands of your day, and that needs to come from slow releasing carbohydrates. So I'm not talking like white pasta, white bread, white noodles. It needs to come from whole grain sources, because they gradually get fed into the body and they're more likely to go into this tank. So I'm talking about, kind of brown rice, brown bread, potatoes, sweet potato, etc. And roughly about portion size, the size of your fist, once that's been cooked, will be adequate to fill that tank up beforehand. But then finally, just on pre-match nutrition, you get your carb intake right about 2 to 3 hours beforehand, so that you give the body time for it to actually be digested and actually come in, because you don't just eat it and it goes straight into the tank. About 2 to 3 hours before. So I always kind of say you need to be aware of what time you're starting. So let's say if you're a club cricketer, and on a Saturday you're starting at 10 or 11 o'clock, I'm starting at 10. I know that 2 to 3 hours before I need to have my breakfast, nothing in between, because it's not going to be digested in time. So that means I know that I'm eating between 7 and 8 o'clock. And I'm getting some form of carbohydrate in with my main meal, size of the fist, once it's been cooked. Then, providing I've had some good form of carb 2 to 3 hours beforehand, I don't need to eat anything in the run up, because I'm already adequately fueled and anything else isn't going to get digested in time. So that's where I focus on my hydration, because that's the biggest thing. So about 1 hour beforehand, you want to make sure that you're starting the hydration process. But hydrating yourself isn't as simple as just drinking water, because if you just drank a liter of water on its own, you'll probably pee out about 300-400 ml of that. So you only actually retain about 60 to 70% of the fluid you've consumed. So what you need to do is really kind of take on some form of electrolyte. So if you see kind of like cricketers, or any athlete, they're drinking like a funny color sort of liquid, it's actually salt. But just been flavored. So the best sort of electrolyte tablets that I recommend, Science and Sport Hydro, you just drop one of those in there, because what the salt does is it makes you retain more water. So if you drank a liter of water, that means that then instead of peeing out 300-400 ml, you only pee out about 100-200. So your retention of the fluid goes from 60 to 70% up to 80-90%, which means you're more hydrated. About 1 hour before, gradually consume that with a hydro tablet, and you should start with, you've been adequately fueled, you've got your carb tank topped up with your breakfast 2 to 3 hours before, and you're starting in an adequately hydrated state about 1 hour beforehand with your water intake and your salt, and you're kind of good to go.
And what about when you're in the match situation, foods to eat during a match, and how important is it to tailor that given what your role is in the side, i.e. a batter or a bowler?
Yeah, massively. I kind of do all this sort of work in the winter. So, most of my involvement is in the winter, kind of setting up for situations, because cricket's a funny sport where it's not like football where you know that you're going to be running around like a dog for 90 minutes, or the same with rugby. You could snick off first ball and then be sat on your backside all day. But then conversely, you could also go on to score a double 100 and then, the next day have to bowl 20-25 overs. So it's very much about prepping yourself for the situation. So if you've got a situation where you're more involved, so let's say you actually perform well and you're bowling, let's say you're on a Saturday, you end up bowling your 10 overs, or, if you're playing longer formats of the game that you end up bowling, in excess of 10, 15, maybe even 20 overs, then you're putting yourself at risk of emptying this carb tank out. So that's where you need to be aware of what fuels your body uses at what intensity. So working at high intensity, body uses carbohydrates. So the focus of my food needs to be on carbohydrate during that. However, if I'm working at a low intensity, the body doesn't really use carbohydrate. We like to use fat. So that's where my food intake needs to focus on the fat. So I lower carb, higher fat when I'm working at low intensity. So if I snick off first ball and then I'm sat down for the rest of the day, I don't need to be pumping myself full of pasta because I'm working at this intensity. So that's why I go down the lower carb route and eat higher fat foods. So I'm talking about nuts, cheeses, your fattier cuts of meats, for example, yogurts, olives, avocados, boiled eggs, those sorts of things. But then conversely, if I'm actually actually kind of participating in, in the game, I actually go on to perform, I bat long, I bowl well, then that's where I have my focus on carbohydrates. And that's where mainly I like to get it from fruit, from a snacking point of view. Your main meals need to still come from your slow releasing carbohydrates, ideally, because anything white and refined can lead you to feel bloated and heavy. And that's the last thing that you want during a game. I remember one of the Warwickshire boys who I worked with a while back, he batted in the morning, then came in lunch and was like, look, I really don't want to eat that, kind of food, a big meal after I batted, just doing the lunch breaks. It makes me heavy and I'm bloated and sluggish. That's the last thing he needs to do. So it's actually about just tailoring that and going for a faster releasing carb that isn't going to leave him bloated. And that's where you get some form of fruit in. So higher intensity, if you perform well, go with the higher carb stuff. And then anything low intensity, bad day at the office, or if you're batting and then you're standing in the field, you get on a low intensity, higher fat foods.
Any recipe tips you can perhaps give for those struggling?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I've got a recipe up here where, a chicken wrap, really easy one, kind of mid-game. So essentially that's got whole grain source of carbohydrate being in the wholemeal wrap. Be very careful with bread. Make sure that it says whole wheat or wholemeal on there. Just because it's brown doesn't mean that it's actually a slow releasing carbohydrate. So if it just says wheat flour, that's essentially just white flour, which isn't what you want to have. So this wrap, essentially, it follows the same structure. So I'm talking about like in between innings or a lunch break. The wrap's got slow releasing carbohydrate in the wrap. So I've got my portion of carb. Then it's loaded with chicken, which is my protein. Then if I'm a vegetarian, that's where you can incorporate things like your beans, tofu, corn fillets. We're looking at things like quinoa, lentils, those sorts of things. Or, if you are a vegetarian, you eat cheese, things like halloumi cheese, paneer, your harder cheeses. They provide a good amount of protein and they can act as a protein source. Then I'm trying to get some vegetables in there. So I've got some salad in there, so some lettuce, some tomatoes, etc. And then we've got some avocado and a little bit of Greek yogurt kind of mixed in between that with some spices. If I break that meal down, I've got my carbohydrate in the wrap, I've got my protein in the chicken, or you can substitute that with any other protein source from my food list. And then if you're vegetarian, your protein source is coming from corn, tofu, beans, etc. Then I'm getting my fat, my avocado and the yogurt, and then I'm getting my vegetables and the lettuce and the tomato. So it follows that sort of structure. And then little snacks in between. If you're working at a high intensity and you go, well, that's where you mainly go for your fruit. But then if I'm going at a low intensity, that's where things like your cheeses. So Baby Bells are a big staple of mine. So like mini cheeses. So you can get also little cheddar sticks, things like nuts, olives, deli cuts of meat, all of those sorts of things. Yogurts as well. If you've got the capacity at the club to store that, those are great little in-game snacks.
And the importance of nutrition when it comes to recovery. You touched on it earlier. Again, any food sources that you recommend and a recipe advice as well?
Yeah, so before, your focus needs to be on fueling yourself up. That's where it's carbohydrate. But afterwards, yes, you need to get fuel back in, i.e. you need to refill this tank back up, especially if you're playing multiple day formats, or if you're playing back-to-backs, if you play on a Saturday and a Sunday, you want to get some form of carbohydrate in afterwards, making sure it's slow release. But your main focus needs to be on protein, because essentially your muscle is just a ball of protein. So if I want to make that ball of protein bigger and stronger, i.e. repair and recover, I just add more protein to it. So essentially it's the same way as building a house made out of bricks, that if I want to make that house bigger and stronger, I just stick more bricks onto it. And so let's say if we look at, during a game, for example, or even a training session during the winter, if you're going into the gym, essentially what that training does, or what your performance does during the game, is essentially flick a switch in the body to say, let's start the muscle building and recovery process. If I use the analogy of building a house, it sends the builders to the house and tells them to go and build a house. But if you don't provide them with the bricks, they can't do anything. And the bricks for the body is protein. So essentially, it's as if that as soon as you finish any form of session, whether that's a training session or if it's the end of a session of a day's play, you flick the switch in the body to say, start the muscle building process. And then you need to provide the body with the bricks that it requires, i.e. protein, and all of the sources from the protein section of the food list, the best source of protein you can get. So we're talking like your meats, we're talking fish, again, vegetarian wise, corn, soybeans, other beans, so like black beans, kidney beans, tofu, etc. Getting those sorts of foods in are key, because it essentially allows the body to continue that recovery. So recipes wise, again, I've got a chow mein recipe, which you can use beef, you can use chicken. That's on my website. It's also downloadable as a PDF from my website, so you can download that to your phone and use it. Again, that follows the structure of whole grain source of carbohydrate in the noodles. So it's whole grain or whole wheat noodles. You can use whole grain rice noodles. The brand is, you can get Mama. You can also use the Blue Dragon ones. That's the slow releasing carbohydrate, going to fill up my tank. Then I've got the protein source in the meat or the beans, the tofu, the corn, etc. that I use. There's lots of vegetables in there. We've got bean sprouts, carrots, peppers. Those are my veg. That's going to improve the immune system, because exercise suppresses the immune system. And then there's also some fat in the oil that's used, high quality sources of fat. So we're looking at olive oil. There's a little bit of there's some sesame seeds in there as well. And if you can go for a fattier cut of meat, that'll up the calorie content in your food, which is one of the biggest things. Because again, if you've worked all day and you're working at 5,000-6,000 calories in a day, you want to make sure you can up your food, your calorie intake. Easiest way to do that is high quality fats.
You talked about the importance of hydration, water intake, salt intake, etc. What about caffeine? And talk about coffee. Yeah. There's a lot of myths about the subject. Can you almost demystify the subject?
Yeah, well, so with caffeine, it can be a very useful tool. That the thing is, most people assume that how caffeine works is that it kind of like gears you up, it jolts your nervous system up, improves your reactivity, which is correct. But for me, the main reason why I utilize it is not just for myself, but also guys that I work with, is that caffeine makes you feel like something is easier than it actually is. So for example, let's say if I've got a scale of difficulty, 1 out of 10 being I'm literally sat on my chair all day, 10 out of 10 being I've just finished a yo-yo test and I'm absolutely cooked. Let's say if I'm working at a 9 out of 10 during a day's play, what caffeine does is it makes me feel as if it's actually an 8 out of 10, so that then I can push myself to what normally feels like a 9, but it's actually a 10. So I can push myself a little bit further to be able to do that. Now, a couple of problems with caffeine. Well, first of all, there's a myth that caffeine dehydrates you, which is correct if you're not a habitual user. So if you don't drink caffeine on a regular basis, it can dehydrate you. However, if you are consuming caffeine on a regular basis, I'm talking like more than a cup a day, then actually essentially you're just drinking hot water with a teaspoon of coffee in. So it is hydrating, but the big problem with it is the impact it has on sleep. So I would always say what people don't realize is that caffeine can stay fully active in your system for up to 12 hours. So if you have a cup of coffee at 10 o'clock in the morning, it's still active at 10 o'clock in the evening. And one of the biggest problems with caffeine is that, first of all, prevents you from being able to get to sleep, which is where you fully recover. You know, if anyone's ever had a late night coffee, that they're buzzed and wired, it's difficult to get into sleep, but then also prevents you getting into that deep sleep where the immune system is repairing itself. So if you're having coffee, be mindful, it's going to be active for 12 hours, anything before 10 o'clock at the latest. Performance wise, even if you had your caffeine in the morning, it will still have a beneficial effect on your performance in the evening. It still continues.
Cricket is a unique game in the sense that you've got lunch breaks, tea breaks, etc. You touched on it. You gave the example earlier how sometimes a player might not want to ingest the food that's been served on the table. Any tips, any advice you can give on supplements that a cricket player could potentially take instead of the actual food served?
Yeah. Well, first of all, what I will say is that I would always try and get your food from whole sources, because let's say if I look at some beef, for example, yes, it gives you protein, but you will also get a good amount of iron, B vitamins, and potassium in there as well. However, the supplements, if I look at whey protein, you're just getting protein. So you're missing out on all these additional things. You get a couple of other things in there, yes, but it's not as nutrient dense. So from a supplementation point of view, that's where smoothies can come in handy, as a mid-game and specifically like mid-game or even after a game if you are, you know, short on time. Because I can literally, if I look at one of my favorite smoothies, really easy to make, I just get 200-300 ml of milk, put a scoop of whey protein in there, put a tablespoon of peanut butter and an avocado, blitz that up, and it's like drinking Nutella, but I'm getting kind of everything that I need, and it's a very good source of protein. So immediately after, a whey protein shake can be really beneficial because it gets digested very quickly, so it goes straight to the muscles, and also it doesn't lie as heavy. Sometimes you might not want to have, you know, a big steak or, you know, a large meal immediately after. So that's where getting a protein powder in can be useful. But in general, with supplements, they supplement, they don't substitute. So you've got to be aware of that, that yes, they can have performance benefiting effects, but if the whole diet's not right, they're essentially pointless. So I only look at supplements with an elite athlete once we've got the whole diet right. So once we've got the diet right, the supplements that I would look at utilizing is, first of all, whey protein shake. That's the obvious one, mainly immediately after, but then an easy way to up your protein intake throughout the day. But then also looking at creatine. So creatine monohydrate, you know, out of all of the supplements available, that is the one that's been most researched and showed a proper beneficial effect. So what creatine does is essentially increase your strength and your durability. So looking at creatine, that can be useful. Again, I've done a couple of videos on creatine on my website. So if anyone wants to find out some more details on that, have a look. And then another one, which is really interesting, which we use at Warwickshire, is beetroot juice. So beetroot juice essentially contains a compound in it called nitrate, which can then get converted into something called nitric oxide, which essentially increases the delivery of oxygen throughout the body. So it can increase sprint speed, but then more importantly, it can improve that sort of perception of effort. So the same with caffeine, it can make something feel easier than it actually is. So beetroot juice about 2 to 3 hours beforehand can be useful. A company called Beat It, that's beneficial. And the other one's omega-3s. You can get that from your food sources, so your oily fish, your nuts, your seeds, but proper omega-3 fatty acids can be very beneficial from lowering inflammation, help with injury and recovery. There is some research to suggest they can boost muscular growth, but then also they can improve your mental performance. But one final thing to touch on with supplements, that you have to be careful with the supplements that you're using, because supplements are most of them are made in the same factories as the other drugs. So whenever I'm recommending a supplement, they have to be batch tested, because about 70% of supplements are actually contaminated. And this is a really big thing. So if you ever see on the news that an athlete has tested positive for a supplement and they've been adamant, for a drug, and they're adamant I haven't touched it, well, sometimes they're actually saying the truth. Sometimes they're lying out the backside, but sometimes they're telling the truth and they just consumed a contaminated supplement. So it has to have the Informed Sport logo on there. So if you just go on the Informed Sport website, just go on Google, type in Informed Sport, and then type in the supplement that you want to potentially pick up, it'll come up with a list of all of the supplements that have been tested, that everything that is in that supplement is in that supplement. So I'd always recommend that from a safety point of view in general anyway.
Again, with cricket, the nature of the sport, the long nature of it, you do burn a lot of calories. Would you recommend the player, whatever level they're playing at, to count their macronutrient intake? Or is it all about just getting the right foods in?
Yeah, no, I'm not a big fan of it. You know, I've worked with a cricketer actually before. I won't say who it is, but when I first started out with them, they were obsessed with this sort of like macronutrient. They were addicted to MyFitnessPal almost, really. And it became mentally just so intense. And it'd be like, if he, kind of had 2 grams extra carb or 10 gram extra protein, he'd feel like he'd failed and couldn't fit in with it. And you start to look at food differently. You start to look at food as numbers as opposed to food. And what you've got to realize is that, again, if I'm working with an elite athlete, yes, they're an elite athlete, but most of the time they're just 20-odd-year-old lads or women who are just doing something extraordinary. So you've still got to look after them from a mental point of view. And I find that myself, I have to eat exceptionally well. It's my job. But I don't count my calories. I don't count my macronutrients. I purely focus on just following those set food groups and going, right, my main meal needs to be protein, fat, veg, and carb. And my snack needs to be protein and fat, or protein and fruit, depending on the situation. And I find that by following that, I end up hitting a very good macronutrient ratio anyway. So just focus on the foods. And I only ever like to get up to that sort of level if you're trying to squeeze out 0.05% or so. You know, just focus on your food, get a solid base, and then potentially look to do that later on. It can be useful, you know, logging your food. But again, the thing is that if you look at the protein recommendation for muscular growth, it's, you know, between 1.2 and 1.8 grams of protein per kilo. Now, for some people, that can be a massive difference. Let's say if you've got someone who's 100 kilograms, that can be the difference between 120 grams and 180 grams. And the research says that it's somewhere in between. So there isn't like a perfect, oh, I have to eat 140 grams of protein, because it says, well, 120 grams would be perfectly fine. Versus, do you get what I'm saying? So, you know, just focus on getting your food groups right, and don't obsess over calories. Don't obsess over it. Listen to your body. You know, if you're not being fueled correctly, follow a simple sort of structure and just get your good foods in.
And if we just move on to the subject of alcohol.
Yeah.
Our players, they love a drink after a game, but even at the highest level, you have seen on TV, in between test matches, players sharing a drink, celebrating, you know, a batsman getting a double 100 I've seen on TV. You being a nutritionist,
yeah,
what are your views on it?
Yeah, it's tough for me, you know, because I have to compromise. And again, I go back to it that I've got to look at it as, you know, I'm looking at a lad or a girl who's 21, 22, and you think about what were you doing at 21, 22, and they're just a normal person who's doing something exceptional. So you've got to have that balance. And at the end of the day, when it comes to alcohol, the type of alcohol is important. That technically one beer after a game, yes, it has an alcohol content in it, but it's only 5%. And 5% of that is alcohol. Technically, you look at that, there's some carbohydrates in there, and it's technically most of it's water. So it will help rehydrate. But the problem I have with alcohol, so you have to get the balance between, cricket's a very sociable sport. Typically, you know, the culture of cricket is centered around having a beer afterwards. Like you look at club cricket, what do? Everyone sits around, has a beer in the sun. It's nice. You know, you look at Ian Botham, you know, you can't imagine me telling him not to have a beer. Like, yeah, not going to happen. You know, so you have to compromise. And as long as they're not drinking excessively, that's fine. Now, from a nutritionist point of view, I wouldn't say that alcohol is beneficial to performance, because the problem is that, first of all, I spoke about immediately after exercise, the body essentially starts recovering and repairing. What alcohol does is hinder that process. So let's say if you didn't have any alcohol, your body's recovering at 100%, alcohol brings that down to 70, 80%. But then also alcohol significantly impairs your sleep. So it might send you to sleep quicker, but it impairs the quality of your sleep, i.e. you have a portion of your sleep called REM sleep, where your eyes are pinging back and forward and you're dreaming. That's where the body's repairing itself. Alcohol stops you from getting into that efficiently. So with alcohol, moderation, 100%, but then ask yourself, is it worth it? Am I just having a beer with the boys for the sake of it? Or am I having a beer to celebrate that I've just scored a double 100 or just beat top of the league? You know, do it in moderation, but make sure that it isn't a regular thing and part of the routine.
Is it also the best time to have a cheat meal? Or again, is it just all about picking and choosing?
Yeah, see, I'm not a fan of like looking at it as like the word cheat meal as well, because it's almost like, you know, again, even myself, that I have to be perfect with I have to be very good with my food, but I also have a life. You know, I like to have a pizza. I like to have, you know, go out and have a curry. And it's about asking yourself the question of, you know, is it worth it? And if I can get that sort of most of my diet right 80 to 90% of the time, and this is why whenever I'm working with someone, the most important part is getting to the point where like, I can see myself sticking to this long term. And, you know, that's the same with an elite athlete, that the main thing that I'm focused on is making sure that they can follow the way of eating 80, 90% of the time, which then allows you that 10 to 20% of the time to go and have a pizza or go and have a few beers and kind of live your life, but then fall back onto a way of eating that is just habit, as opposed to, oh, I've got to start my diet again. So my biggest bit of advice to anyone watching this and wanting to improve their nutritional intake is make sure that the food that you're, you know, using to improve your performance, improving your health, is something you enjoy and you like, because then it's easy to fall back onto it. The concept of a cheat meal is almost that like, oh, I've been following something I really haven't enjoyed, I've been incredibly disciplined, I've got to go and have a pizza, because then it can spiral. Now, one thing that I will say is that there is no benefit metabolically to eating rubbish food. Like, you know, you hear kind of some people will say, oh, a cheat meal or, you know, having a pizza will spike your metabolism. No, you're loading your body full of crap. How is that going to be beneficial to you physically? But mentally, it's nice to do that. So my thing with a cheat meal is, find your own balance. For me, I kind of have it about every 2 weeks. So once every 2 weeks, I'll go out and have a few beers, or I'll have, a pizza or whatever, to stay on track with things. But that's nice. It makes me feel like I'm still enjoying my life and I'm not being a robot. You don't have to be a robot to perform well. You get that 80, 90%, yeah, 100%. That you'll be beneficial. But, and you've got to look at the context of it. If you're Mo Farah trying to, win an Olympic gold, then you probably want to avoid those sorts of things. But if you're just looking to improve your performance and lead a healthier, better life, then getting that 80, 20% balance is fine, but making sure the 80% is something you like.
Callum, perfect, fascinating insight on the subject. Get some great tips, some great recipe tips as well in this chat. Again, we'll put the link in the description below of your website. So whoever's watching this, please do check it out. But yeah, perfect. Thank you very much for your time today, Callum.
Thank you so much, Neel. I really, really appreciate it.
So Neel Khagram, Cricket Life Stories, Callum Walker. Thank you.